Hello, everyone. Welcome to the episode 3 of Speakeasy Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about oil insurance and the anatomy of a supply shock. I'm your host, Jacob George. I'm a first year Master of Public Policy student at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Today, we're going to decode the economics of a war. On 20th February 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran called Operation Epic Fury. And within a few hours, we saw the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes every single day, ground to a near halt. Over 150 tankers were stranded. Oil prices have now roughly surged up to $120 a barrel. And now we are starting to hear terms like stagflation, supply shock, strategic reserves, which are in textbook concepts, but now we're seeing them all over the headlines. To help us make sense of what is happening, we today have a guest, Professor Shashidharan Gopal. Prof is a senior lecturer for economics and the co-chair for Masters of Public Policy program at LKY. His research spans monetary transmission, trade policy, global value chain, and financial development. We thought he was a perfect fit to sort of bring in and explain the economics of this story. Prof, thank you so much and welcome. Thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks, guys, for having me. Very kind of you. Well, it is interesting times for sure, and you really nicely, framed it. So, do you want me to get started, or do you?
Maybe we'll
Mm,
start by trying to sort of put things into context.
sure, yeah.
In that sense, I wanted to understand this event of 20th February. What makes the Strait of Hormuz specifically such a dangerous choke point that's it's able to trigger something at this scale that we are seeing today?
Right. Great question and perfect way to get started. In fact, I'll try not to take another class here, but I'll try to dip into all the macro story that we cover in classes. So let's start with a very foundational observation, right? So, like you rightly used the word choke point, right? This is not just any other oil shock, right? I mean, we've seen many oil shocks in this world, in the history. The most recent, probably you would remember, is the Russia-Ukraine war. But this is a choke point shock, right? And what distinguishes this from other shocks, which you mentioned, alluded to in the beginning, was that 20% of the world oil is shipped through these waters. But beyond oil, I also want an underappreciated fact is that even just today there was an article in the Financial Times where the waterway also ships chemicals, metals, fertilizers, and whatnot. Right. So now take helium or sulfur, for example, right? So they can affect semiconductors, right? They can also affect the food industries. So, which means you are not just looking at a traditional oil shock or energy shock, which everybody expected to happen, but this is going to see you carry all the way, transmit all the way to your supermarkets near you. And that is a very, very powerful shock in its own right. And that's, of course, a geopolitical weapon. And the country at the helm understands this very, very cleverly. And so there is a lot going on around it. But if you think about the economics of it, it is complicated from the point of view of the just very basic fact. It's not just a traditional textbook oil shock, but it's becoming a choke point shock. Already it has become one, and that is distinct from, let's say, what happened in the COVID pandemic or any other disruptions we're talking about, right? And I would also add one other dimension that people forget, but this is a war, an escalation, right? So the shipping infrastructure, capacity, these are long run issues and long term issues for any economy. And they are also destroyed and damaged. So it is not so easy for you to open these up tomorrow and get back to normalcy if your capacity is damaged, right? If it was a COVID shock, was a pandemic, right? The policy decision can be to close and stop trade today, and then tomorrow when they decide that the policy is reversed, you can go back to trading and business as usual. But that is not going to be the case with this shock, and so that's really what makes this very unique, right? I mean, if you want to mean, yeah.
So, Prof, I think you mentioned that this is a shock, and I think that is a concept I want to drill down for a
hmm
second.
hmm
We constantly are hearing that if the war drags on for more than 5 weeks, oil might cross an X amount. This might turn into a longer term problem. Then you have US administration going out and saying, no, this isn't a longer term problem. Once we settle the war, things are going to go back to normal. So, when we look at this shock, how do you think one should look at it, and what parameters should one look at it to understand whether this is a short-term shock, long-term shock? What are the systematic aspects of it? Could you help us sort of break that down, the nature of the shock?
Yeah, very, very important aspect to the discussion, in fact, and it's a very difficult one to answer. Let me be honest about it. If you remember from our own macro classes, the real story of whether the economic ramifications can be understood. How do you understand the economic ramifications, even if it's a choke point shock, right? All depends on whether you are treating this, you meaning a policymaker, right? As a policymaker of a country, am I going to treat this as a temporary transient shock? Or is it going to be a permanent structural shock? Because the playbook varies dramatically depending on how you assess the shock to be. But here is what becomes where it becomes trickier. We There is no standard definition, like you pointed out. There are many, many metrics, ways of looking at this, but there is no one size fits all kind of an approach. Oh, this is temporary, and this is the point in which it is going to become permanent, right? So before we get into those details, so let's just also take a step back and understand if it's a temporary shock. There is a We've seen this in history before, and it is despite the gravity of the situation with being a choke point shock and all that, that textbook story always very clearly tells you if it's a short term issue, just deal it like it's a short term issue. Don't be interventionist, right? So just let it go. Yes, there is going to be a short term pain for sure. Nobody is denying the inflationary outcomes or the stagflationary outcomes that you brought up, which is again contraction in outputs. So there is going to be a growth slowdown. It's going to take a hit. You are going to see inflationary spikes for sure, but it's going to be short lived and things are going to go back to how they are eventually. So you don't have to necessarily feel the urge to fix something that is broken, right? That's what most policymakers would like to do if they see these things go out of control. But the textbook is very clear on that. And that is as far as it goes, as far as understanding this as a temporary shock is concerned. But the problem is, like you said, how do you know it's a temporary shock and how long can we keep believing that this is a temporary shock? And this is where the story gets a bit muddled and uncomplicated, and even the analytical part of the story gets a bit tricky here, right? So let me put it this way. Now, think about this. If you are a policymaker and if I were to treat this as a structural problem, then I have to bring in a lot of variables, right? So can I do something about it? If I can do something about it, what can I do? And then how do I go about doing it? So these are very different questions. And this answer obviously depends on who you are, right? So if you're the US, it's a different story. If you are in this region, it's a very different story. So that is going to be a lot dependent on who you are talking about, right? That will come to that. But one of the things that I have not seen much being reiterated in the press and other places is that are we really treating this as a binary distinction, like temporary versus permanent? I mean, that's what the textbook tells you. There's nothing analytically wrong in thinking about it. That's the right way, in fact. But think about our own behavior, right? Economic agents are starting to behave as if this uncertainty is there to persist. And this persistence is not sitting well with any of us. So you're going to the supermarket and you're going to stockpile almost everything that you find because you think, COVID drama is playing in my mind. Tomorrow I'm going to go to the supermarket. I'm going to be running out of these essentials. So that's a classic consumer behavior, right? Investors are behaving in the direction that you would expect them to. It's a lot of uncertainty. We don't want to do anything right now. We're going to wait and see attitude. So economic agents are somehow behaving as if it is a permanent shock already, even if there is actually a credible possibility of this ending in the next couple of weeks or next week. We are already seeing that happening. So this is what for me, makes the story a lot richer analytically, but also a lot more complicated for the policymaker, right? Because you don't know how to break this down and how are you going to actually fix it, right? Because everyone in my country is behaving this way, and so I mean, if I notice that, then do I just stand by and watch and do nothing, as what the textbook will suggest, or should I do something, right? So then how do I
How do
approach
I
it? Yeah,
proceed?
exactly. Yeah,
So then, Prof, I want to ground it to policy
yeah,
responses, right?
yeah.
We see that certain events have happened. You are seeing a lack of supply of gas, oil, and other
Sure.
critical commodities in the market.
Absolutely.
Um, Purely from an economic perspective, let's not account for specific country level
Sure.
nuances here.
Mm.
Purely from an economic perspective, what are the policy options that governments have right now to respond to this kind of shock, and how much of that have they exercised already?
Great question. Again, I think the best toolkit to think about this is what happens to economies when they are hit with stagflationary shocks, right? So stagflation, as you know, comes from a combination of inflation and stagnation or contraction in output, right? Now, this is specifically attributable to a negative supply shock, as we talked about, right? So this is, and we don't know whether this is temporary or permanent. If it is there to stay, then you have to catch up with your policy responses, and it requires a more coordinated response per se,
Correct.
right, across, and depending on your policy space that you are left with, right. So without getting into the specifics, even just basics of looking at it from an analytical standpoint, you would say that if you are hit with a negative supply shock, you want to wait and see from the first instance. Yes, there is going to be short term pain, like I said, but can you handle it? That you can wait until you have that cushion to experience that pain, well, for things to reverse to where they used to be. And if there is even a slight possibility that is going to happen, it's best not to do anything, right? So that's why traditionally monetary policy or any kind of demand management policies are not going to really help you here, because one thing is going to make the other thing worse. So what's the one thing? So on the one hand, you're talking about tackling inflation. On the other hand, you are talking about compromising or fixing growth, right? So to you, both are important, and growth, and if you derive, it is also unemployment, right? So you want jobs, you want economic activity, and you don't want to compromise on that. But they are taking a huge hit, right? What is your tolerance threshold? But at the same time, you're also going to see inflationary spikes. And then eventually everything is going to snowball and is going to go out of hand. So depending on your political compulsions, policy space, you have to now decide, am I going to tackle inflation or growth? The problem with a negative supply shock from a analytical, the aggregate supply, aggregate demand, sort of a textbook perspective, is that you are really trying if you're trying to tackle one by focusing on, let's say, I want to increase growth, right? Because I've lost a lot of growth, I can't afford to have it anymore, so I stabilize my demand through my demand management tool, and I try to do something with it, like, so maybe increase fiscal expansion, or increase monetary expansion, right? If I do that, then I'm going to make the inflationary problem even worse, right? Then I might get a little bit of growth, but I may end up actually making the inflationary problem even worse, right? If I'm going to do the opposite, which is to tackle inflation head on, then I'm going to make the growth pains even worse, right? So how do you deal with it? Well, the best option is to do nothing, right? But the question is, can you handle that, right? Again, that depends on who you are as a country, and then which region you are situated in, and what are your backup options, right? And frankly speaking, for a choke point shock, I don't think anyone in the world is equipped to handle this for a long time. And in some way or the other, it will boil down to some hard choices, and that's what the fate of most emerging markets in this part of the world, in Asia and ASEAN, is all about. And you may be better prepared, and this might happen, but you are not really actually. You have to make some hard choices, right? So that's how I look at it. Yeah.
I think you mentioned something very interesting, which is emerging markets. So we see that part of this debate. You have people at the US saying we are insulated from this because now we are an oil exporting
Mhm.
country.
Mhm.
So unlike before, this is not going to affect us. On the other, you have emerging market players, especially Asian countries like India,
Yep.
China,
Mhm.
Pakistan,
Mhm.
who seem to be extremely exposed to this shock.
A lot.
My question is two-part in terms of how much of this is true, how much of
Mhm.
these countries are exposed, insulated,
Sure.
and what sort of options do these countries really have to play around with?
Well, a multi-layered question here,
Yes.
right? So let's start with the U.S., right? Just for simplicity, right? Um, Two things to keep in mind. One, it is true there is a fair, I would say, degree of merit in the argument that the U.S. oil dependence is much less than what it used to be. That there's nobody disagrees with that, right? And now, if you pair that with all the shale revolution that the country has experienced, well, so that makes the U.S. relatively insulated, right? From such a shock. But then obviously it's not immune. That's an exaggeration, right? So it's not complete immunity. You are insulated. Nobody is, right? And the US consumers of all are going to still see a spike in gas prices, and they're going to see a broad based increase in inflation. And that's not going to go down very well with the US citizens right now. I mean, it never has in the past, and I don't think it was going to change right now. So that is how you look at at least the basic story of the US being insulated is from a relative standpoint. Yes, not as bad, but definitely not immune. They are also going to take the hit. But more importantly, from my perspective, if they are hit with a stagflationary shock, and I'm going to be definitely criticized for saying this, but they, despite all the problems that the country has been facing right now, I do think that they have the tools to handle it, and they do have the policy space to handle it. Right now, may not be that easy as it used to be in the past, but the Federal Reserve, despite all the recent drama that we are very familiar with, we are attacks on its independence and whatnot, it still has the, let's say, the credibility to sort of anchor inflation, the expectations from inflation, and it can also make sure that if they hold the rates or raise the rates, they can actually handle the inflation spikes, right? So they can. And an additional factor which you can't ignore is the capital flowing into the country, the types of crisis. I mean, it didn't happen all the time, but 9 out of 10 times it does play out that way. There are exceptions even in recent times, but when you do have such shocks and people do flock to safety, and this used to be the traditional story of how capital continues to flow into the country even if they are the epicenter of all the problems, and you still find people believe in the dollar. This might be changing, and we
Yeah.
all know that from recent history,
Correct.
recent past, that they may not, or you can't take it for granted any longer. But if that were to happen, then they are still comfortable. If you think about your loanable funds, from
Yes.
add that from your class discussions, you continue to have that extra cushion, that supply of loanable funds coming into the country, and foreign investors pouring money back into the country, which could be utilized well if they decide to do that. Right? So, in some senses, you can revive the economy. You can stimulate the aggregate demand side of the story. You can also handle the inflationary pressures. So, I mean, stagflation is tricky to handle, but they can handle it, right? So that's really my take on, and that hasn't really fundamentally changed
Yeah.
in my opinion. But you brought up India
Yeah.
and China and others, and that's really where the story is right now. And I think that's very obvious for this region where we are sitting right now. There's a lot of heterogeneity first. I mean, there's a lot of variation in the way each country will be affected. Like, say, Malaysia is an exporter, so probably not as much heat. But there are countries which, and Singapore can handle these things better than any other country can at this point. But India and China are two very unpredictable stories right now, right? But from the point of view of oil, I think this is a really, really bad, whatever is panning out is really bad for both the countries, despite all the strategic reserves and all the arrangements they have made. It is not going to be that easy, right? So I think I have some numbers here. Like, so China, Japan, India, Korea, they all account for nearly about 70% of the oil that flows through the Hormuz. I mean, I think I tried to fact check, and it was
Yes.
about the
A
ballpark, it was
ballpark
right.
number.
And that's significant, right? So beyond the obvious structural dependency that this sort of creates in these countries, right? The policy space that these countries have to respond to such shocks is where I think it gets really interesting, right? And it's where it is what is going to be make or break for these countries, right? So three things, at least from my point of view, that matter, right? From a very traditional analytical toolkit, what were you looking for? What will you be looking for from a policy capacity, policy space standpoint, right? So one, like I said, expectations of inflation being anchored. Are they sufficiently anchored right now? Not quite. Especially after exiting the COVID pandemic, we are still reeling under that impact for a while. So suddenly, before you can realize, there's another geopolitical tension, there's a tariff war, there is trade war, and then again now you are caught in a bind, and then now you have this, right? So there is going to be a problem on that front. So inflation becomes a bit important to tackle. You can't let it be there and say I have tolerance for inflation. You can't do that. So that is becoming a bit of a tricky territory for them. Second, which is kind of also now becoming, unfortunately, not just an emerging market problem any longer. I used to tell this in my classes. It's now becoming a US story as well. Is about fiscal dominance, right? Now, central bank policies have now becoming increasingly coming under pressure to accommodate the fiscal pressures from the governments, right? And if you want to keep lower rates, which is what you want to do as a accommodation, that is not really to especially to monetize government deficits, and my students might remember this as printing money sort of story. Then, if that's the case, that is not really going to help you in the fight against inflation, right? Very clearly, right? So that is another. So to what extent is this fiscal dominance story playing out, and central bank independence is going to be under assault, and the policy making space that they have is another angle to the story. Three, not discussed much, which we haven't covered at all until this point, which is an important issue to keep in mind, is exchange rate pressures. right? So your capital outflow, I mean, your capital flows react to interest rate differentials. We know that. And so if that's the case, and you're going to keep your interest rate lower compared to the US, which is still higher, so there is going to be a reversal of capital very, very significantly. And that can hammer a lot of currencies. And you know very well in this region, policymakers are extremely averse to letting their currency weaken because it is also becoming a strategic political statement to make. And that intervention has not really helped any country, and it is giving conflicting mixed signals, right? So you don't help yourself when you have depreciationary pressures on your currency, or rather currency weakens because there's a massive capital outflow. And then what that ends up doing is doubling down on the inflationary pressure that you're already facing with imported inflation, and that is making the stagflationary pressures even worse, right? So this is how I look at the landscape of India, China, this region, and then you look at how the US is. So US is still very well positioned to handle this if they don't dig their own grave even more than what they have done until this point. They still have the institutions in place to deal with this, right? But I certainly feel like our region has a long way to go, and it is something to watch out for. But these are the three things I would be looking at from an analytical standpoint. Yeah, I hope that answered some of the
It
questions.
really does, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
we've got a larger idea of
yeah,
how the economics of this will play
yeah.
out. I'm a little interested about like the trade aspect of it. One of the major variable that we're seeing right now is insurance. We're seeing that what essentially stopped movement of trade wasn't just Iran, because Iran never really shot up many
Yeah,
ships. It was insurers sitting around the world refusing to insure
yeah,
ships. Then you saw the US government stepping in saying we will provide naval ships to escort, we will provide insurance, even that not
yeah.
resolving it. Help us unpack how sort of critical
Sure.
insurance is to dictating how trade really happens within the world.
Wow, that's a great question. You clearly know more than me on this front about this. I'm really not an insurance expert, but I mean my colleagues are. I can give you a my take on this from a very different the way I see it, right? Um, so uh, if you think about insurance obviously is very, very important here, and all Iran needed to do was to make that passage uninsurable, right? So the threat of escalation, the threat of if you send your ship, I'm going to take care of them, sort of a threat was enough for traditional markets to pull out, traditional insurers to pull out, underwriters to pull out, which actually made this whole thing very complicated, right? Now, by doing so, you've already landed in a market failure situation, right? Now, think about the who actually ended up generating this market failure sort of situation. It was the US. Now, after doing that, you are now offering government intervention to fix the market failure problem, which we all learn in our economics classes. Right. So, if there is a market failure, there is a justified role for government intervention, but not when the market failure was created by the government itself. Right. So that's the irony of the situation to me. I mean, this is the way I look at it. I'm not saying I'm not really not an expert at this field as far as insurance story is concerned, but I do feel it is very ironic, and that is also coming at a very significant cost. First of all, they're not doing a great job of that, even though they can blanket guarantee all these things. People are not convinced. Second, where's the money coming from? I mean, who has the financing resources to do that? I mean, you're probably going to use taxable, I don't know, taxpayers' money to commit to these things. I mean, I don't know. I really am fuzzy on the details. But then, if there is a plan, if it's a credible fiscal plan, that's fine. But then, where is this money coming from? Nobody really understands, and so that complicates the story a little bit more, right? So they may end up actually losing on this front as well, and this is going to force a lot of countries to start asking this question: if this trait can be so weaponized right now, what kind of geopolitical alliances and fragmentation that I should be actively looking out for, and alignments that I should be to do that in order to avoid a similar situation. I mean, how else will we learn our lessons, right? I mean, the COVID pandemic resulted in a lot of supply chain resilience and all that because it gave rise to the fact that, okay, you can't be overly concentrated in a particular, when the shock hits a particular epicenter, you need to like really diversify. So then you start doing these things. So now you are in a better position to handle a pandemic type event, right? But this sort of event was, I mean, an escalation of any kind of military nature was always on the cards with different parts of the world. But then nobody expected this choke point shock to be the first thing that people will, the countries will go after. And when that started happening, then there is no easy way to make sense of how best to position myself to defend against a future event like this, right? So that is where I believe geopolitics is going to continue driving this trade and capital, in terms of alliances a lot more, and they are going to play a role. So you talked about trade, shipping, and how they're going to reorganize. Of course, there is still mostly the traditional variables will still matter, but then I think India, China, to a large degree now negotiating with Iran, and there are. I believe Malaysia was also recently doing something. I'm not entirely sure, but all these alignments are going to really now define the alternatives and how trade is going to happen. So again, you are retreating more from this ideal world of like, oh, efficiency drives whatever I'm trying to do. This is a business decision. I will do this if it makes sense to me from a cost efficiency angle, right? So that is gone, and you are now trying to incorporate geopolitical variables and as a explicit uncertainty shock or a cost of uncertainty in your models, and that is something to look out for, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, yeah.
But so, Prof, just sort of to ground
Mm,
this,
mm,
and
mm.
probably my last question
Yeah,
to
yeah, sure,
you
sure.
is the idea that we're seeing we have been seeing post COVID. Changing trends in trade, countries becoming inward, countries looking to regional partners. We have been seeing a lot of trends happening, especially in the realm of trade. Do you think there are certain specific trends that we need to look out for that might see major shift as a consequence of this war, where countries might look for other regional partnership, like how the Liberation Day triggered newer free trade agreements? Do you think this war might trigger certain trade related newer trends, or fast track newer trends that we haven't seen yet?
Um, Honestly, I think the shocks are of a nature where you are. I mean, the gravity of the shock will be different depending on what happens and how it pans out, temporary, permanent, all the things we discussed. But as far as the nature of the shock, regardless of whether it's permanent or temporary, still forces you to think about the old patterns of like how you would react if this were to continue, right? So taking a leaf from what happened recently with all the tariff war and all the Liberation Day tariffs that you mentioned, I don't think there is nothing, anything more left in terms of strategy for countries to explore. I mean, what else can you do? You can't trade with the moon. I mean, you,
Yeah.
you obviously have to figure out a way to work with your own regions and have regionalization of supply chains and however inefficient it sounds and things like that. And that's what happened. COVID resulted in that kind of a push. And slowly, multinational companies started reorganizing their production facilities and whatnot. And I think it's just going to accelerate those trends. So one thing that has happened really is that geo-economic fragmentation or geopolitical fragmentation driving trade and capital flows were just a very episodic issue to be taken note of for maybe for this season we have this as the theme, but to next season it'll become irrelevant, right? Now that is not the case any longer. So I believe that it is being taken so seriously that one of the things to watch out for is that every country moving forward can't just ignore these geopolitical realities, and that is unfortunately, way the way most policymakers have to think about right now. And I think most of the alignments will have those calculations in mind. I think that should definitely be in their calculus. If it doesn't, or if they don't feature there, then you are going to be a victim when other similar shocks hit you, right? So, but I would say that regardless of how this ends up panning out and whether we move back to normalcy or not, I do think, as we always finish in the macro classes, domestic capacity, domestic policy space, and don't forget your fundamentals, and don't forget the fact that growth comes from long-term sources, and continue to do your homework right, and you don't have to excessively intervene in something that you don't have to. So you continue to do what you need to do to get your basics right and foundations right. That is still going to be ultimately the savior. But all these shocks are going to continue to happen around you. So then as a reactive measure, you can put in place certain things that will allow you to weather the storm and ride the tide at that point. But now, considering how structural these problems are becoming already, you can become a bit more proactive, right? So earlier it used to be very reactive. So now you can actually start proactively having these buffers in mind that when this contingency hits us, how are we going to react to it? So that's how I look at it.
Thank you so much, Prof. I
Thank you.
think we, going forward, when we see all these news and developments, will go and analyze it in a much more informed way. And for that, we will always be grateful for you. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to the third episode of Speakeasy. I hope you everyone had a good time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I hope it was useful. Yeah.